We'll continue our lecture with part 2 here and talking about the phylum Annelida. The phylum Annelida is one that you're well aware of. These are the earthworms. And the thing that we have to define for us is what anterior and posterior mean, particularly in animals like this. The anterior aspect of any animal is where the head is. So if you talk about the anterior part of an earthworm, it's going to be this part of the earthworm. The posterior is where its tail is, which is back here. Frequently also where the anus is. So it's that end that contains the tail. Now in an Annelida, and there's actually a better picture of this in an upcoming slide, the earthworm has to travel through dirt. And they have little spikes on their bodies that stick out so that you can see them better right here, that stick out so that the earthworm can grip the ground that it's moving through. And these bristles that come out of the abdominal wall are called setae. And they are primarily for the purpose of moving along. Now, as we talk about the anatomy of an earthworm, we start out on the anterior end. We start out with the end called the pharynx. And this sucking action that occurs at the pharyngeal end of this worm leads to the intake of earth into the mouth of the worm. Now the worm basically just takes in a bunch of dirt. And in that dirt is the material that the worm can digest and eat. It just indiscriminately takes in a bunch of dirt. In that dirt is food that it can actually eat. Now it moves down the digestive tract. Here's the esophagus to a point called the crop. Now the crop is what we would call in ourselves a stomach. It's just a storage area. Whereas this takes in dirt, moves it along, it's stored in this area until it can be moved to the next organ, which is here, which is called the gizzard. Now this is the first animal that has a gizzard, that we'll see that has a gizzard. And a gizzard, you'll frequently see a gizzard in animals that don't have teeth. Because animals that have teeth chew their food. Well, animals that don't have teeth can't chew their food. So what they have is a powerful muscular organ that acts to do the same thing. The dirt in there and rocks and little gravel that's in here act together to grind up and mash up any food that's in that dirt and allow it to be smaller and smaller pieces so it can be absorbed in the intestinal tract. So there's your digestive tract of the earthworm. If we look at past the digestive tract, we find the passageway where the food substances are then taken in after the food is removed, and then it ultimately carries all the way down until it's expelled out the anus. And 90% of what comes out this end of the worm is dirt, is the same dirt that came in this end. Now the nice thing is that when you have a lot of worms in your yard, you have this processing going on, and it tends to cause the dirt to be loose, and it allows it to take in minerals, etc., and water, and it keeps the dirt from becoming hard packed. So having worms like this is actually very good for your dirt. Now, actually, probably on the previous slide is a better picture of this. We have what's called the nephridium. Here's the metanephridium here and here. And I'm just looking to see if there's a better picture of this, but there really isn't. It shows here what the metanephridium is, and that is the area, what we would think of as a kidney. The nephridia is a place where the waste products of metabolism, that's not the waste products of the ingestion of food, but the waste products of metabolism are collected and removed, which is how we would define our kidneys. And then the nephridia pore is where this material is then exited from the worm and gotten rid of. And so this is essentially analogous to in another animal, the kidney, and then the excretory system, the urinary system. Now this shows the circulatory system of the earthworm, and there are basically two main blood vessels. There's the dorsal blood vessel. Notice that the anterior of the worm is here, the posterior of the worm is here. The dorsal blood vessel is toward the upper part, or toward the surface of the dirt, and then the ventral blood vessel is toward the ground itself. And these flow along the back of the earthworm. The ventral blood vessel flows along its belly. The dorsal blood vessel flows along its back. On a human, the ventral aspect is the front of the human. The dorsal aspect is the back of the human. And then they have these aortic arches. You have 5 aortic arches shown here. And the aortic arches are muscular blood vessels that pump the blood through the circulatory system. And this is the first circulatory system we've seen. You remember the Cnidaria and the Porphyria didn't have a circulatory system. They just transported water through their bodies. And this circulatory system, it's important to show that this is what's known as a closed circulatory system, which is that all the blood remains within an enclosed container, blood vessels or the arches, and never is released into the other aspects of the animal. Now this shows the brain and nervous system of the earthworm. And what you have is a moist layer that covers the entire earthworm and allows for the transposition of gas. This is actually how they respire, how they take in oxygen and allow carbon dioxide to be removed. At the same time, they have these masses of nerve cells called ganglia, which occur at various points. And this is the first creature that has some degree of nervous organization. Again, the Cnidaria and the Porphyria do not have anything closely resembling that. And from these masses of nerve cells, you have nerve fibers that travel along and innervate the various parts of the worm. Worms are hermaphroditic. Hermaphroditic means that they possess both male and female sex organs. So they can be both mother and father. Frequently, they fertilize other worms, and so they're not their own mother and father at the same time. The worm has a storage area called the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicles store sperm, and they also have these sperm receptacles, which take sperm from another worm. They have an ovary and an oviduct, which they produce eggs. So if they receive sperm from another worm, they can fertilize those eggs and produce new worms. They can also fertilize other worms themselves, and that's what's meant by hermaphroditic. Oviducts are areas that the eggs travel through, and when two worms are mating, they form a slimy attachment with each other, known as a slime tube. As I said, the seminal receptacle is an area in a worm that receives sperm from another worm and fertilizes the eggs. So when you see two worms mating, both worms are exchanging sperm, and both worms will end up fertilizing eggs and producing eggs. One is not the male or the female. They both function with both sexual organs and identities. The next phylum is called the Planaria. This is the Planaria right here. Planaria have crossed eyes. They have an pharynx, which they take in food into their gastrovascular cavity. They have a brain, which is a collection of neurons, and a series of nerve cells that move and nerve fibers that move up and down their body. They also have seminal receptacles and a genital chamber, so they are also hermaphroditic and can produce both male and female eggs and sperm. But they have one interesting ability, and that is the ability to regenerate. They can grow missing parts. And one of the experiments I did when I was in high school was I actually cut one of these dudes into 3 pieces. Cut him right across here and right across here. And lo and behold, in about 5 or 6 days, as I watched him, I had 3 planaria. The other thing I did that no one else had ever accomplished in class is I cut his head in half right between his eyes. Pretty lucky because these things are moving all the time. Cut his head in half and he grew 2 heads, believe it or not. Now we're going to finish up by talking about the phylum Mollusca. The phylum Mollusca you're aware of because you know about clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. And all of those are part of the phylum Mollusca. This phylum is characterized by several things. First of all the animals in this group have what's known as a mantle. A mantle is a sheath of tissue that encloses the vital organs of the mollusk. It also produces the shell and is responsible for respiration. So it is a very important part of the animal. The second thing about mollusks is they have an open circulatory system. That is, there's a period of time that the blood is not within the circulatory system. It's free within the animal. And then it is recollected in another part of the animal. They have a shell. All of them, except for a rare exception, have an external shell, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the shell is multi-layered, and it's, as I said, produced by the mantle. Thirdly, they have what's known as a visceral hump, which is a part of the mantle where the heart, digestive system, and excretory organs all reside. Now, one type of mollusk is called a univalve. A univalve is a mollusk with one shell, or whose shell is composed of a single piece. So not a clam or a mussel, that's a bivalve. A univalve is something like a snail. And the mollusk moves on something known as a foot. And you've seen this when you've looked at a snail. It's a univalve with a single foot that it travels on. And the snail has a organ in its mouth that have a scraping material that scrapes food, and this is called the radula. And here you see it right here. And it moves along and it can scrape food and then take it into its digestive system. And you see here's the stomach and the intestine. And here's the visceral hump here. And the heart is here. And the shell on the outside protects it. The mantle is this blue area right here that produces the shell and then covers the entire visceral aspects as well. Bivalves have 2 shells. So here's a snail, so that's a univalve. Bivalves have 2 shells. And the bivalves are things like clams and oysters and so forth. And they have a very similar makeup as the univalve, with the exception that they have 2 shells, and their foot is also important for locomotion, but they're not able to move the way the univalve is able to move. Gastropods are just another name for univalves because they tend to move along on their stomach. Their stomach is actually part of their foot. The cephalopods, which I don't think are even spoken about in your book, the cephalopods are squids and octopi. They have no shell, or if they do have a shell, the nautilus has a shell, but the squid and the octopus does not have a shell. But they have a very tough internal area that, like a beak, that acts somewhat like a shell. And so that completes our lecture. It's a pretty straightforward lecture. We will continue to move on and probably complete most of this book before Christmas. We will not complete this book completely before Christmas. We will have a few lectures, and then we will begin to use the other book. So if you haven't purchased the human anatomy book and human biology book, then you need to purchase that in the near future.